everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Poorly Drawn History. The video clip of me writing Poorly Drawn History doesn't want to work, so you're just going to get to see me slowly erasing it. Today we're going to talk about Violet Jessop. Now, if you have no idea who Violet Jessop is, don't feel bad, because I didn't either. Violet was born Violet Constance Jessop to two parents in 1887 who had 9 children. Unfortunately, 3 of them died, leaving only 6 living. Now, because Violet was the oldest and her 2 parents had to work all the time because they had to provide for their 6 children, Violet had to take care of each of her other 5 siblings. That is until Violet became ill as a child, and the doctors diagnosed her with tuberculosis and told her and her parents that she wasn't going to live. Surprisingly, she did. Unfortunately, Violet's father died when she was 16 years old, which meant her mother had to work even harder now because they needed the money. Her mother got a job as a stewardess for the Royal Mail Line. She chose to move herself, Violet, and the rest of her children to England so that they might have more opportunities. This continued until Violet was 21 years old, and then her mother became ill and she could no longer work to support the family. Violet chose to follow in her mother's footsteps and chose to apply to become a stewardess. And yes, I know there's supposed to be an R in there. I don't know how I missed that. She didn't automatically get the job. In fact, she had to dress herself down because she was too pretty to be a stewardess. But eventually she did get a job at the Royal Mail Line, and that's where her career at sea began. After working for the Royal Mail Line for a few years, she moved to the White Star Line, which, if you're familiar with anything about old ships, you'll have heard the name. But she didn't take this job without a little bit of apprehension. She'd heard stories about the White Star Line, and she didn't really want to cross the North Atlantic in bad weather and bad seas. She'd also heard that the guests were all very demanding, and since most of them in first class were worth millions of dollars, the stories were probably right. Still, Violet accepted the job with White Star, and in 1910, she was assigned to work on the Olympic, which was a giant ship that definitely did not look like this. In 1911, while out to sea, the Olympic and the HMS Hawke, which was a British warship, collided, and it damaged the Olympic enough that it had to limp back to port and not continue on the journey. Luckily, this time, there were no casualties. I'm pausing our story to give you a little lesson about the White Star Line. So they had 3 ships. They had more ships, but they had 3 main ones, and they were sister ships because they looked very similar. And they were called the Olympic, the Britannic, with 2 N's, and the Titanic. And we all know about the Titanic. We already know what happened to the Olympic, so we're going to get rid of that. And we're going to get rid of Britannic and Titanic as well. At 24 years old, on April 10th of 1912, Violet boarded the RMS Titanic. And just like her other job, she was going to be a stewardess on the biggest and the unsinkable ship. And we all know this story. We all know how it ends. On April 14th in 1912, the RMS Titanic hit a giant iceberg. It took enough damage that it would end up sinking within just 2 hours. As the Titanic sank into the cold, icy waters of the Atlantic, lifeboats were lowered and Violet was put on one. Not necessarily to save her life, but so she could show non-English speaking passengers how to behave. They also handed her a baby, and she had no idea whose baby it was, but she took it. The ship, the Carpathia, rescued all the Titanic survivors, and when she boarded, a woman ran up and grabbed the baby. She assumed it was his mother, and she never saw them again. But she was safe, so I guess that's all that really matters to this story. After having been on 2 of the White Star Line's sister ships, both having hit or been hit by something, and one having sunk, killing over 1,500 people, you'd think she'd be done with the ocean and her line of work. But she wasn't. She did get a little distance from the White Star Line when she joined the British Red Cross and was assigned to a ship as a stewardess and nurse. But she didn't get too far because the ship she was assigned to was the HMHS Britannic, which was the 3rd sister ship that had been converted to a hospital during World War I. Unfortunately, just like her sister ships, the Olympic and the Titanic, the Britannic seemed doomed to a bad fate and a second bad spelling. She experienced an unexplained explosion and began taking on water, and she would sink a short while later, killing almost 30 people. Violet was loaded onto a lifeboat, this time sans random baby, and looked like she would be getting away. Except they loaded the lifeboats too soon, and the propellers and the sinking of the ship began pulling the lifeboats toward and underneath the Britannic. In order to save herself, she had to jump out of her lifeboat and ended up fracturing her skull on the Britannic. Somehow she survived again, and she went on to work for the White Star Line again. And then she went on to the Red Star Line and back to the Royal Mail Line before retiring in 1950. In her memoirs, she described herself as having had a short and disastrous marriage. And other than that, she lived alone until she died at age 83 of congestive heart failure. So there it is. That's the story of Violet Jessop. What do you think? Was she the luckiest woman? Or maybe the unluckiest woman? You tell me. Leave your answers below, and don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more of these. Bye!